Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Better Luck Gamer, and today we're kind of going to be going on a bit of an arc. So many archetypes have been released for the last few books, so I figured for the immediate future anyway, I'm going to be covering a lot of the archetypes that I have either yet to cover or maybe I've covered already slightly like on stream. And so I hope you're all ready for some of the cool archetypes that have been released. I know I am. Now, today we're talking about the Starlit Sentinel. Now, the Starlit Sentinel is really fun, but I gotta say that this particular archetype is for a very specific kind of campaign. I think more than any of the other archetypes in the game so far, it is one that's it's fun. The whole point is it's for fun. You're playing essentially Sailor Moon. You're playing a magical girl. And this can be for, whatever gender your character may be, so you don't have to worry about that. And they do have some quite cool powers. But there's a lot of the lore behind it that, you might have to reskin if you're playing a more serious campaign or the like. So the Starlit Sentinel, they're essentially magical girls. They're given their powers by one of the constellations of Tian Xia to get powers. And in the lore bit, they're like talked about being as normal townsfolk or something like that. But obviously, in practice, they're going to be on some kind of adventurer. Now, one of the cool things about this Starlit Sentinel actually is that there are supposed to be only 12 at any given time, as any constellation can only give their powers to one individual. And in lore, in Galarian, there is 4 Starlit Sentinels in Goka, which is in Tian Xia. So, technically, your character, if they decide to go with the Starlit Sentinel, is one of 8 in the entire world. That's kind of cool. Now, obviously, for your own setting, you can have it be any way you want. This is also really great fodder for an interesting narrative. You can have an entire Starlit Sentinel campaign where everyone must take the Starlit Sentinel archetype as the bonus archetype feat, essentially. And the whole point is telling your own magical girl story. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff you can do with the Starlit Sentinel. So beyond all that, let's talk about what it actually gives you. So first of all, when you're a Starlit Sentinel, you gain a random piece of like an accessory or gear or something that looks mundane, but acts as your seal essentially to activate your Starlit Sentinel powers. This item can only be used on your character, so even if another character gets it, they cannot activate and gain your powers instead. And if you lose the item, you have to spend a week of downtime to reflect in order to, I guess, get a new one or have the constellation give you a new one. It's essentially just a week of downtime if you lose said item. Other than that, you gain the Starlit Sentinel transformation. Now, the Starlit Sentinel transformation does give you an entire second identity. It's insane because when you're in this particular form, you're automatically under the effects of a disguise. You don't have to make any deception checks to pass off as someone else, and anyone who's trying to identify who you actually are is going to be up against your deception DC, which uses your deception modifier plus 20. So unless your character does not invest in deception at all, no one's really going to be able to know who your character is unless they roll absurdly well. So this is kind of like a better vigilante for the sake of disguising who you actually are, though obviously there are differences between the vigilante archetype and this one. So you don't have to worry about it usurping vigilante, but no one's going to really know who your character is unless you tell them. And there's not really anything bad that happens if people know who you are. So this is mostly, again, it's just based on the Sailor Moon magical girl kind of stuff. A lot of this archetype is really based on that kind of idea. So if you don't want to play a magical girl or Sailor Moon or something, this archetype might not be for you. But I will say it's really fun and there's a lot of cool things it does. Now, in addition to this transformation, which does transform all your gear, whatever's in your possession, yada yada, all that kind of stuff, it doesn't change what your equipment actually is, just its appearance. But in addition to this, while you're in this form, you get a +1 status bonus to damage rolls with whatever weapon you're using. And you can fling bolts of starlight from your weapon. Your weapon gains technically a secondary attack that you can make that does a d4 force damage, and it has a range of 60 feet, and it uses all the same runes as your weapon. Now, there's actually something interesting here as well, as there's no prerequisites here. It's like, as long as it works for ranged attacks or anything like that. It doesn't state that. So even if you have a weapon that normally is only for melee weapons, these range strikes can apply the runes for that weapon. Granted, it's only for a d4 force damage, per fundamental rune you have on your weapon, per striking rune, essentially. But still, that's pretty cool. That's a lot of interesting stuff. But that's kind of the base. So you get a full transformation. No one can really tell who you are. And you gain a bonus when using your weapon, a +1 status bonus, which is really good. And you gain a ranged secondary strike with whatever weapon you use. So very, very solid. Up next, you get the Special Sentinel technique. And I guess I didn't mention this before, but you can pick Starlit Sentinel up as early as level 2. So this is a whole campaign worthy of archetype, which is very interesting. At level 4, you can get the Special Sentinel technique. So the Special Sentinel technique gives you one of 2 focus spells. Now, you either get the Luminous Stardust Healing, or you gain Shining Starlight Attack. So, and for all intents and purposes, these are considered arcane spells, and you become trained in arcane spells with a trained proficiency, and you use your charisma modifier. So what do they do? Well, first let's talk about the Luminous Stardust Healing. This one essentially gives you 8 healing per spell rank. So whatever spell rank you are, multiply by 8 or whatever you have access to, and that's essentially what it gives. It starts out as 16, and then every 1 rank above, it goes to an additional 8. Now, this also allows you to attempt to push a creature that's possessing someone out of that person's body by making a counteract check versus their possession. Now, the range for this is 30 feet, and it's 2 actions. And I gotta say as well, the possession thing is not super common, but if the creature does manage to, if you fail to counteract the possession effect, the creature is then immune for a week. But you can still heal the creature that is being possessed as normal. So this one, pretty good. This is essentially like Lay on Hands, which is very, very powerful. Though this one has a range of 30 feet, which is really good. Now, the other focus spell, which, by the way, you can take this feat multiple times to get both of these focus spells if you really want to, which, honestly, you're going to really have to if you're focusing purely on the Starlit Sentinel, as there's no level 6 feat. So you'll end up getting both of these if this is your pure focus. So, and actually, no, you do have to get both of these because of the bonus archetype rule, or the archetype rule, where you need to select at minimum 3 feats before swapping out. But I guess if you're mixing this into your class, you really don't have to. I just always use the free archetype rule. It's really, really good. Most people should. But yeah. Anyway, Shining Starlight Attack. So Shining Starlight Attack is a 2-action, essentially cone and or line, based on your constellation. So when you start the game, and this is something that I'm a little irritated about this particular section of the book, because it doesn't tell you in the beginning or really anything about the constellations in this archetype. It does in the book. So if you have the Tian Xia character guide, then you can go and read those sections in the book. But if you don't, if you're using something like Path Builder, for instance, you really don't know anything about the constellations or what they stand for, which is, I think, very much a miss for this particular archetype. Now, if you bought the book, then you can just go look at that section. But a lot of people don't buy the books. A lot of people just use Path Builder to use the new options. So yeah, it's a bit of a miss. Now, the damage does start out for this particular attack at 2d10, but it increases every spell rank by an additional d10. Now, and this is all based on a basic save based on the type of attack you get. And here is the constellation table that tells you what kind of damage they do. I'm not going to go over each of them, but you can see here that they're either a line or cone, reflex or fortitude more often than not, with only the sovereign dragon constellation having will, which is important to note. So yeah, it's a pretty decent attack. Honestly, for a focus point, you can do 2d10 or more damage. Oftentimes it'll be about half, give or take, like on average, because most enemies will either pass fail pretty standardly. It's a pretty good focus spell for a very solid attack. So really great options overall for this particular feat. I definitely think the Special Sentinel technique is something that is going to help round your character out more than it's going to be something you're going to use super frequently. As one, if you only get this one feat and you have no other focus spells, you get to use this essentially once per combat. Oh, I don't even think I mentioned. So the Starlit Sentinel, you can only use the transformation once per hour, and you can only stay transformed for 10 minutes. That never changes. No matter how many feats you take in this, that's always going to be your limit. So this particular archetype dedication is not even meant to be used consistently over the course of an adventure, and more for like one-off day events kind of deal, like episodes you could look at. Now, of course, if you're just going as an adventurer, then you have your other adventurer stuff as well. But, just something I want to mention, you're not going to be using this in every combat. And by the time you're done, your team's probably going to want to rest to get focus points back. In fact, if you rest to get your focus points back from using the special technique, then your transformation is going to be done by the time the next combat comes around. So this is essentially like a twice per dungeon, once per day kind of thing, depending on the pacing of your adventure. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to the special techniques, as well as the transformation itself. All right, at level 8, we have probably the most broken feats of Starlit Sentinel, which is Majestic Proclamation. Majestic Proclamation is you do your transformation right there in front of the enemies. See, this is the weird part about the whole Sailor Moon kind of thing. A lot of the times when magical girls do their transformation, it's in the presence of their enemies, which means that the people who would use their identity most against them pretty typically knows what they look like in their standard form. A little bit of a miss, if you ask me. To be fair, most of the enemies in Magical Girl cartoon stuff do not typically live on Earth. They're cosmic entities pretty typically, but not always. The whole, again, there's a lot of this that doesn't necessarily make sense. It's just for the fun of being a Magical Girl. So take it as what you want. Anyway, Majestic Proclamation. Now, you don't actually have to use this as a part of your transformation, so you don't have to reveal your identity to your enemies. But I will say you can use this particular feat as a singular action rather than two actions if it follows immediately after your transformation. So, why I mentioned it before. But what does it do, right? So what is this Majestic Proclamation? Well, it's a 30-foot emanation, demoralize for all your enemies. That's no longer auditory, purely visual, so they don't need to understand your language. And not only on top of the normal demoralize effects you get it, but it also dazzles the enemies if you succeed the check on them. And the dazzle lasts for a minute. That's really, really strong. Dazzle is a really powerful condition. It makes everything essentially concealed to the enemy, meaning they have a flat check to just miss pretty much anything for the rest of the combat if you succeed. And if you crit succeed, which, by the way, if you're focusing heavy on your particular skills, like demoralize in this situation, or intimidation rather, then by the time you hit legendary proficiency, unless an enemy is particularly strong against intimidation, they're going to get blinded for a minute when you crit succeed on them, which is incredibly devastating. This is really broken, honestly. I would say, in my personal opinion, I would reduce this down to a round, I mean, Demoralize already is essentially A rounds because they usually are just made Frightened 1, maybe Frightened 2 on a crit success, which is 2 rounds. But the Dazzle and the Blinded are absurd. And not only that, but your allies can just hide in plain sight or right in front of them when they're dazzled. So this is absurdly powerful. A minute of being dazzled or blinded is really strong, to say the least. So I gotta say, Majestic Proclamation is an absurdly good feat, and you should take it. Granted, it's a game. Do what you want. I just think this one is really, really strong. Next up, we have Blade of the Heart. This one is a really fun feat and not nearly as strong as Majestic Proclamation. So what it does is for a singular action, and you can plunge your weapon into the heart of one of your willing allies, but it harmlessly passes through, and then you pull it out, and your weapon now gains a rune buff. Now, the rune that you can use, is there even a limit? Yeah, it's Corrosive, Flaming, Frost, Shock, Thundering, or Vitalizing. So up to essentially, well, actually, it's as many friends as essentially you have, and each friend will have a unique rune. Now, the first time you use it on that friend is when you decide what rune their heart essentially inscribes upon your weapon, but every time you do it after that point, that will always be the same rune, and I guess unless your relationship with them maybe changes, but that's not actually specifically stated here in the particular feat. But if we're going narratively speaking, I would allow it to be changed if maybe your dynamic or that person's personality changes, which honestly shouldn't happen too often. But yeah, you get a unique rune per ally that you can put onto your weapon. Now, this still counts towards your normal maximum limit of runes you can have on your weapon, but the best way to really consider this is you get a free rune on your weapon that you can swap between different runes for different kinds of situations, which is really good. And because your ally has to be adjacent does make this a little bit weaker than a lot of other standard kind of feats that do this. But to be fair, the Magus has something similar, but they need to spend a focus point in order to do so. So in regard, it kind of balances out. You do need to just run up to an ally, shove your weapon into them, pull it out. What I find especially funny is just you have an absurdly big weapon like a warhammer or something, and you just have to plunge it into them and pull it out, and it comes out, sparkling with new powers. It's very, very funny, very, very interesting. I do like this one. It gives you a variety of different attack types you can do on different kinds of enemies, and of course but at level 16 you get the greater version of these runes, which typically allows them to pierce certain resistances to their damage. So something like a flaming rune becomes just standardly really good damage after that point. So if you have someone who's kind of your companion in battle, who's always kind of near you, this is a really good feat to pick up overall, and is overall a pretty awesome feat. Now, we do have 2 more feats I'm going to be talking about here, but before we get to that part, I gotta ask, if you're enjoying this content, leave a like. And in fact, if you find other people making content on TTRPGs, I'm going to ask you to leave a like on their stuff as well. Not just Pathfinder, but if it's other TTRPG content, I feel like if it's not D&D, other TTRPGs are really not favorably looked on by the algorithm. So anything we can do to help elevate all ships in the TTRPG field, I would highly appreciate just a little bit of effort. One like, and it's all it takes, honestly, to really get the algorithm going. And in addition to this, if you like my content specifically, then subscribe. I talk about all things TTRPG, but I cover a lot of Paizo products as I have a pretty good relationship with them. Even this book here, I did get a little bit early in, due to that relationship. So if you want to see all the new stuff from Paizo a week or 2 early, this is definitely a channel you're going to want to keep your eye on. So I recommend hitting that subscribe right down there. But all right, let's go ahead and get on with the rest of the video. So next up, we have Desperate Wish. This is an interesting feat. Now, it just gives you access to a spell, which is Breath of Life, and essentially you sacrifice your energy at that moment to bring someone back to life in a dire moment. Now, you can only use this with your Starlit transformation active, and I should say all these abilities can only be used with your Starlit transformation active, so if that was ever a question. Even the focus spells you gain can only be used with your Starlit transformation active. But this one's particularly, once you use it, your Starlit transformation ends and you're done. Now, is this a good feat? I don't know. I feel like there's other ways you can get the same exact effect without such a dramatic loss of character capabilities. But a character dying doesn't happen that often, and well, depending on your game, a character dying doesn't happen that often. And in addition to this, it's very narratively, like, it's got a lot of narrative flair. I love the idea of a Starlit campaign where your character's classes are also tied to your transformation. So it's not just like, oh, I don't get access to my Starlit powers when I'm not using the transformation. Your characters are normal level 1 mooks, level 1 NPCs essentially, until you use your Starlit transformation, and then you're like a Starlit Sentinel wizard or fighter or something like that. And I think that's a very interesting campaign, which would make this particular feat all the more impactful, because then you can never use something like this unless your classicus have it without sacrificing your powers, which is really cool. Desperate Wish has a lot of narrative flair, but if I was to look at this as a purely mechanical feat, it's kind of whatever. I feel like there's a lot of easier ways to get Breath of Life. And Breath of Life isn't even that high of a level spell, if I remember correctly. So, I mean, even just archetyping into a spellcasting class for a few levels, you could probably get this spell a lot easier without having to sacrifice your Starlit transformation. So, on a narrative scale, really, really cool. On a mechanical one, meh. I don't feel like the cost is worth the use of the ability. But then again, if you don't have access to Breath of Life and someone dies, then it's very useful. So, I mean, like, if having Breath of Life is not a part of your plan and you just are picking it up as a part of Starlit Sentinel, this is really, really good. But if you want Breath of Life in any other fashion, there's just easier ways to get this, I feel like. So, yeah, a pretty cool feat nonetheless. And last but not least, here at level 14, we have Sentinel's Orbit. This gives your character a fly speed equal to your land speed, or 20 feet, while you're transformed. So for 10 minutes, you essentially get to cast Fly on yourself and transform for a singular action, which makes this really, really good action compression. Makes one action a huge buff for yourself. And in addition to Majestic Proclamation, you can also spend an additional action to demoralize and dazzle/blind all enemies around you, which is incredibly strong. So Sentinel's Orbit is a very good ability, but considering the action compression already with the class and all the benefits you gain, that actually makes this a really, really good buff in addition to your Starlit transformation. So it's really good when you add everything up together. But yeah, that's going to be it for the Starlit Sentinel. A very fun class, and definitely one that it's going to be really determined by what kind of table you're playing at, whether you can play this or not. I didn't mention this before, but this is a rare archetype, so your GM always has a reason to say no. Starlit Sentinels are incredibly rare, being only 12 in the game's canon lore. And in addition to this, if you're playing in Galarian, 4 of those slots are already taken by characters in the setting. So there's not many. It's kind of goofy. There's a lot of fun stuff here. Does this fit, I feel like, the standard table's general approach to the game? Maybe. I'm honestly not sure, because my table just doesn't play like everyone else's table. For us, this kind of thing would have to be very much altered and tweaked from the initial lore to kind of make sense in the games and like the general themes and kind of stories that we like to tell. But honestly, if a player wanted to use this, I don't see it being that strong. Well, maybe not Majestic Proclamation. That's really, really strong. Majestic Proclamation, I think, is a problem. And if there's any reason not to let a player take this particular dedication, it's Majestic Proclamation. That's absurdly strong. But everything else is pretty fine. All the other archetype feats are pretty like minor bonuses, not that strong in all honesty. So I would definitely allow most of this archetype dedication just regularly if we're basing it on its mechanical finesse. But if we're talking about Majestic Proclamation, that kind of shoots it way up into the stratosphere. And in addition to that, the lore, it's for fun. This is a fun archetype. So if you like having fun, if you have a table that's already not very serious or are very serious in a kind of goofy or lighthearted way, then I think the Starlit Sentinel archetype is for your table. And I gotta say, this definitely has made me think of some interesting campaign ideas you can do just with this archetype alone. Like the whole idea that the characters are not even their class levels, their class is tied to the Starlit Sentinel archetype, where they can't even use their class benefits unless they're transformed, is really interesting. And it can create very interesting campaign dynamics that I think would be a lot of fun. So that might be that's a little GM tip for some of you out there. If you want to play a very interesting short form campaign, run it like that. Run it where the character doesn't even have access to their class. Everyone's a level 0 NPC essentially until they transform, and I think you'll have a very interesting adventure. But that's just my personal opinion. That's going to be it for me. Thank y'all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and may the constellations watch over you. Bye.